I think that's the way a lot of people interpret it, is that verbal is the harder section and people are scoring worse. That's not what it means. This one's fun. Whichever section has a lower score is the section I'm performing worse on. And this is one that I love this question, because this is one, or this myth, this is one that I see from a lot of students who come to me because they go, my score in verbal is in the 30s. My score in quant is in the 40s. And I have been prepping and prepping and prepping and prepping and prepping and prepping on verbal, and I just can't get it to the point I'm at in quant. What gives? Or maybe I am improving my verbal, but it's not having the impact on the overall score that I'm expecting. And I have to break the news to them that probably they've been studying entirely wrong, that they have been dedicating their study in a manner that's pretty unwise. Because an interesting thing about the way this exam is scored, and Eric, maybe you have a little more context on this, is that both of these sections are scored on the same scale. They're both scored from 6 to 51. However, these sections test totally different things and students perform totally differently on them. And as a result, those scores are not comparable in the least. So what a 40 means on quant is not at all what a 40 means on verbal. Right. So I have a slide here that I want to show that really demonstrates this. And this is taken directly from the GMAT website, cribbed it. So what we can see here is, if you look kind of in the middle here, that the average score on quant is a 40.7. So that's the 50th percentile. That means that 50% of students are scoring above, 50% of students are scoring below. The 50th percentile for verbal is a 27.26. Now, that doesn't mean that students are performing worse on verbal. I think that's the way a lot of people interpret it, is that verbal is the harder section and people are scoring worse. That's not what it means. It just means that these scales can be interpreted differently. Yeah. So if we take a look here, for instance, at say 41, a 41 for quant is a 37th percentile. So that's a little bit lower, right? If we look for verbal, we got 41, it's a 94th percentile. So that means that's a very high score for verbal. So the takeaway here, to go back to this previous slide, is that if you are self-studying, if you are building your own study schedule, use percentile rankings for those individual sections to determine how you're performing. The raw score is not particularly helpful from a diagnostic perspective, but also for you personally. So take a look at those percentiles and then focus on that section where you're performing worse to bring up that score. Yeah, Eric, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just kind of back to my admissions days. Percentiles are really about how you rank compared to other people that take up whatever it is that you're being compared to, right? So in this case, these percentiles are simply of people who take the GMAT score, how many of them score in that sort of 41 and above, let's say, for that example. And then, on the quant, and how many of them do that on the verbal section. So I think what it shows is that, makes sense. More people that are going to take the GMAT probably have a little bit more comfort level with the quant section, right? Because, when you go to business school, there's going to be quant, there's going to be, and just looking at the backgrounds of candidates that apply. So yeah, there's more, in a sense, competition there from a quant standpoint than from a verbal standpoint. If there's sort of different type of grad program, it might be the complete opposite. So yeah. Now, how schools look at that is that they will use both, right? So they will look at the total score, which is going to be consistent from year to year to year to year to year, right? So if they say, look, we've been able to see that people who have struggled are below a certain score, right? The percentile, they'll have to adjust over time, depending on how the applicant pool changes or how the GMAT pool changes, right? So, but we always provide 3-year averages. In fact, the data that Erica, you were showing were obviously 3-year averages, and they don't change dramatically from, year to year, obviously, but nevertheless, it's just important to put that in the right context, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a question, kind of related to this myth. a piece of advice that I've given students, and that I know a lot of other test prep providers give students, is to try to aim for a balanced score for admission. So this is getting a little bit into admissions territory.
Sure,
So
sure.
if someone is weaker in verbal, to ideally try to pull it up a little closer to quant. If someone's weaker in quant, to ideally try to pull that up a little closer to verbal. What do you think?
Sure. I mean, I mean, that's good advice in terms of, you don't want to have red flags for the school, right? So, it's the same thing with the subsections, like the integrated reasoning section, right? Which is, not included in the total score, right? So if that's, really low, maybe that sets off a little bit of an alarm bell. But more importantly, when they see higher scores in a particular subsection, they kind of go, oh, we can point to that. That might help to offset some of the lower scores maybe we're seeing in something else. But every school and every program is going to maybe emphasize different things with their admissions committee in terms of what they know about how people have performed on these kinds of tests and how they do in the program. I mean, the GMAT is the most predictive piece of an application in terms of predicting your academic performance, right? Unless you're coming right out of undergrad, and then your grades, I think, at undergrad and your courses you took there will be probably equally as predictive. But some schools will focus more on the quant section, right? I don't hear as many schools focus on the verbal section. But nevertheless, if they see it's really low there, maybe that has some thoughts of, well, what about their English skills?
Right.
And that's where they're going to read the analytical writing assessment for sure, not just for your ability to break down an argument, but also just look at your command of English language, right? But actually reading the text. And then obviously, if you're not a native speaker, you're taking an actual English test, which, the GMAT is not measuring your English skills, right? There are other tests for that.
Your GMAT journey and your admissions journey is going to be, it's going to be school specific, it's going to be personal. So the generalized advice doesn't always quite work. I tend to recommend that it's typically easier to get questions that are lower difficulty, right? Like it's easier to make those lower percentile improvements than it is to make the higher percentile ones. But again, yeah, it is going to be specific. If your school is looking for you to demonstrate a quantitative proficiency that you don't demonstrate anywhere else, maybe you should focus on the quant section. So yeah, I super appreciate that perspective that, you want to personalize it to your exam performance, but you also want to personalize it to your personal MBA journey.